Hey everybody. Every now and then I'm going to do these videos that I'm going to call addendums, and they're designed to go along uh, in the show notes, kind of alongside of um, some of the episodes that we recorded in the podcast in the first 5 sessions. And whether it's because I got a question just so many times, just repeatedly over and over again, that I want to make a video to address that obviously constant question, or whether it's the fact that I just simply made a mistake, I got something wrong, I'm going to do that. I promise you there are details in the podcast that are misstated, just frankly wrong. I learn and I get better as any teacher, as any human being does. We never have this perfect understanding of all truth all the time. So we're going to get things wrong. That's just the nature of humanity and our understanding of who God is and the scriptures and all that kind of stuff. So these addendum videos will just be needed every now and then, and we'll make as many as we have to. That's a part of this living, ongoing, dynamic process that we're a part of. And so today, for this episode, there was an episode that this video is linked with, where I spoke of the parable of the talents and the minas, and we talked about Kalvachomer. But the thing that generated so much discussion was I talked about the sons of Herod the Great, and I talked about history and how Antipas was uh, uh, was this character in the story that went off seeking Caesar's approval and came back and then just butchered the Pharisees. And I told that story. Please listen to the episode if you're like, what are you talking about? Listen to that episode in the podcast. But I had a lot of emails come in from different seminary students or disciples of history, or even professors. A professor or two wrote me that listens to my podcast, and a lot of them said, I think you have your sons of Herod incorrect. I think you said Antipas, but you meant Archelaus. And so I was like, I got that email enough within the next couple weeks that I thought for sure I had that incorrect. So I happened to be studying Josephus at that very moment when that episode was published. When I got those emails, I thought, perfect timing. I'm going to be reading this. So I'm reading through Josephus. Sure enough, in Josephus, definitely talks about a very, very similar story, really the same story with Archelaus, only it doesn't end with Archelaus coming back. You could kind of do that with another story about Archelaus, but Archelaus actually goes, and instead of coming back, he gets banished in Josephus. And so what that means, that one of Mr. Professor Vance Russell was one of the people, one of the good friends of mine, has become a good friend of mine, and he wrote me, and he says what he does when he teaches that in his class is he believes what the parable is designed to do is when Jesus tells this parable, everybody knows that Jesus is speaking about Archelaus, and Archelaus never comes back. Like, he sets sail, but he never comes back. So when this ruler does come back, that last person with the last talent kind of looks like an idiot, because he was assuming in the parable, the king's not coming back, I can do whatever I want. But then the king shows up, and so it throws this spin on history that they're not prepared for. Quite frankly, I love that take on it. Like, that could absolutely be correct. So to restate that, essentially, if the listeners understand that to be the template, then when Jesus tells this parable about ships that set sail to go to Caesar, and he leaves the kingdom in charge of these other folks, and they know that he never comes back. But then in the parable he does. And that would be, just to restate that point, that would be the twist. And Jesus says maybe hint, hint, nudge, nudge of that parable would be that don't think that God is never coming, don't think that Jesus is never coming back. Like, to be sure, God will show up and God will want a record for what you've done. Nevertheless, so that it could just be very, very easily, let me just state this up front, it could be that I absolutely, in fact, have my sons of Herod mixed up, and it's not Antipas, it's supposed to be Archelaus. At that point, I thought I just had it wrong. So I went back to my notes from my teacher, Ray. From my time studying with Ray in Israel, I had multiple records. I had 3 different recordings of teachings that I received from Ray, and I went back and listened to all of them, and in all of those lessons, I thought maybe Ray had misspoken. I thought maybe he had gotten it wrong. But in all of his lessons, he makes the point of identifying Antipas as the Herod of the backstory. And so I thought, man, that is just so weird that he would get that wrong over the course of multiple years and multiple teachings. And so I did some more digging, and it appears that outside of Josephus, we have some other records. We have records, mostly Eusebius. My teacher, Ray, was, I'm finding as I study more and more of his teaching, highly, highly, highly shaped, and I think he loved Eusebius's history. So he's pulling more off of Eusebius than he even is Josephus. In Eusebius, there is a record about Antipas that is very, very similar to the record about Archelaus. And it almost feels like 2 different stories that Josephus told about Archelaus. It almost feels like 2 stories put together in a story told about Antipas. Now, it's very, very possible. Listen, Herod the Great we've studied Herod the Great. He was nuts. And there's no doubt in my mind, even when you just read the history of Josephus, that Herod's sons were almost just as crazy as he was. They were power hungry, and they were scared, and they had reason to be scared. Their kingdoms were being torn from their grasp all the time, and they didn't want a piece of the kingdom. Their dad gave each of them a piece. They didn't want a piece. Each one of his sons wanted the whole thing. They wanted all the power, not a piece of the power. And so they were always fighting for different parts of the kingdom. It's very possible, very, very possible, that Antipas, historically, had a very similar story to Archelaus, that he too set sail. Well, they all did. At one point, they all did. All of Herod's sons set sail for Caesar to plead that Caesar would honor the will of their father, Herod the Great. And at different points in their rulership, whatever kind of rule they had, they would often spend time pleading their case before Caesar. You can read all this in any of these historians, Eusebius, Josephus. You can read about it there. But in this story, Antipas does in fact come back and slaughter a whole group of Pharisees because of what he blames them for Caesar. Basically exactly what we said in the podcast. That could be wrong. We could be wrong. But after doing some digging, I'm gonna stick with what we taught there, and I'm gonna say lean more on Eusebius than Josephus for your history there. Quite frankly, I was just watching a show the other day. I'm not going to call it a documentary. I'm not going to give it that much credit, but it is based on a lot of historical Greco-Roman scholarship, and that show was even doing a very similar thing with Philip, with the 3rd son of Herod. So you had Philip all the way in the north. You had Antipas in the region of the Galilee and Samaria, and then you had Archelaus, who didn't rule for a very long time, only a few years. With all of his involvement combined, only a few years did Archelaus rule, but he was in Judea. So Archelaus was in the southern kingdom of Judea. Samaria and Galilee was Antipas, and then far up north above Galilee, was Philip, kind of with Caesarea Philippi. We've talked about that before. And this show had a very, very similar story for Philip. So who knows? who knows what the exact history exactly was? How much of these stories are being blended with the different historians? Anyway, I just wanted to throw some backstory in there to give you all just kind of further like tools to know what you're looking for and know what to dig for, to know what I dug for and kind of know what I found and kind of where I'm at on that teaching. And so that if you're listening and you run across that and you're like, oh, I'm going to email Marty, maybe you can have some more information before you email Marty and do some more looking there yourself. So that's where I'm at this point. That's what I found. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Oh, let me close by giving you, I have wrestled with, since talking to my friend Vance, I wonder even if the different gospel writers are actually doing something, actually pulling on different sons. It would make sense to me that Luke could be pulling on, Luke deals with Antipas almost entirely in his gospel, almost entirely in his gospel. Luke is almost entirely pulling on Herod Antipas. He's one of the only gospel writers to even mention Herod Antipas, but Herod Antipas is his focus. I feel like the parable of the Minas and Antipas is built far more on the Antipas story and character. When you see the parable of the talents in Matthew, I have wondered if he's writing to his audience is Jewish. I wonder if it's more Judean. And if it's a more Judean Judaism that Matthew is pointed at, it would make sense that he would tell his parable, which is moved from where Luke tells the parable. Matthew puts it in a completely different location, which changes the context slightly. I've wondered if Matthew isn't actually wanting the reader to assume Archelaus. Is Matthew wanting you to think Archelaus and Luke wanting you to think Antipas? I suggest that as a real good possibility. It's actually where I lean these days. I actually think that's what's taking place there. But when we spoke of Luke particularly, I wanted to address that. So there you go. Lots of fun details to nerd out about the Bible. We all love that. Hope you find that helpful. So there you go. Look forward to chatting next time. Thanks.